Thank you very much, and good evening and happy Pride Month. I'm honored to lead off the Future Church Pride series, and I look forward to what the next two speakers will bring to this important conversation later this month. So mark your calendar when it's mentioned, I'm sure at the end, what they'll be talking about and when the dates are. I want to thank Olivia and Russ and other staff people for this very kind invitation. I'm delighted that you folks are all following so effectively in the huge footsteps of Chris Schenck and Deborah Rose, whose leadership of Future Church set the bar high. I've been asked tonight to explore how feminist and queer theologies can mutually inform and strengthen each other. Moreover, I'm asked to say how members of these two communities can work together to secure their rightful place in the life of the church. My view is that feminist and queer theologies are already of a piece as their roots are intermingled, and they both inform the whole of theology. We need to know this history, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight, in order to do our part in this work. My experience is that there are many more than two communities that need to work together, many intersecting groups focusing on equity, justice, care of earth, all of whom are needed for the huge tasks of planetary survival and social justice at hand. Let me begin with a word of context, and then I'll move into my analysis. As Ross said earlier, these are dizzying times, sometimes in multiples of 34, if you know what I mean. On the Roman Catholic Church front, to which I confine most of my remarks tonight, things are tough. Despite the drumbeat of synodality and the hope it engendered in so many well-meaning people for a participatory church, three recent events, two of which Russ made mention of, have clarified once again that such a dream of working and walking together probably will not be realized in the lifetime of any of today's earthlings. Nonetheless, we have to do our respective parts to prevent further damage and to create religious and cosmic space that will be healthy and holy for generations to come. We do not need to do anything more, and we cannot do anything less. I'm using the we tonight because the vast majority of us, at least the ones I know on this in this session, are Catholic, although we have some prominent Protestants with us as well. So the prominent Protestants will have to imagine themselves as part of the we, just to get a feel for what some of the Catholic problems are. Let me take a quick look at the three incidents which illustrate our context. The first, of course, is the declaration of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, Dignitata Infinita, on human dignity, that came out in April of 24. It included a laundry list of problems treated in 20 pages and without distinction as to the respective gravity of these various problems. They include poverty, war, injustice to immigrants, human trafficking, sexual abuse, violence against women, abortion, surrogacy, euthanasia and suicide, marginalization of people who live with disabilities, gender theory, sex change, and digital violence. Phew! Take your pick. But the meager theological gruel offered by this document and the cruel conclusions, especially on abortion, surrogacy, trans, non-binary, queer people, left a bitter taste in many Catholic mouths. Moreover, the writers of the document teed up future theopolitical struggles parallel to the one on abortion. The Vatican telegraphed its blueprint, which informs conservative Catholic Supreme Court justices. I'm sure they're not sitting in their chambers pondering theological tomes, so they're eager for such cliff notes to ethics to set their agendas. A second element of the context was also referred to earlier, and that is the recently aired interview with CBS journalist Nora O'Donnell, who asked Pope Francis, and I quote, "For a little girl growing up Catholic today, will she ever have the opportunity to be a deacon and participate as a clergy member in the church?" His immediate and resounding no was like a bucket of cold water in the faces of those who have worked tirelessly for the restoration of the formerly operative diaconal ministry by women. He clarified, adding ice cubes, that anything that was, however, vaguely related to orders for women was off the table. He obviously hasn't heard of RCWP. ARCWP, or other ways in which women who are Catholic are ordained, but that's for another topic. He publicly extended the ban on women's priestly ordination to include the diaconate. So much, I say, for synodality. And the third instance, the third problem in our context, 3 strikes and you're out. 2 weeks ago, Pope Francis allegedly uttered a homophobic, homo-hating slur about gay behavior in a meeting of Italian bishops. He apparently said the quiet thing out loud. The Catholic seminaries have a large proportion of queer people, especially of gay men. A good spin and a logical conclusion would have been that, nevertheless, the institutional patriarchal church continues to operate as it always has, with gay men in power and around the edges. Instead, he is said to have reinforced earlier instructions that the church, and I quote, cannot admit to the seminary or to holy orders those who practice homosexuality, present deep-seated homosexual tendencies, or support the so-called gay culture, all of which clearly require more careful analysis based on scientific and sociological resources. How much practice do you need to be queer? What qualifies as a deep-seated homosexual tendency, and just how do you measure it? Does knowing the lyrics of Somewhere Over the Rainbow qualify as supporting gay culture? I think the gentlemen of the Vatican protest too much. Or this may have been a very subtle way of saying that all Catholic seminaries will now close since there are too few students who qualify. I rather doubt it. I think Francis was reflectively mouthing the public relations-driven policy, which everyone knows is honored in Catholicism in the breach. That is, it is ignored. Meanwhile, he impugned the lives and ministries of many of his closest brothers, friends, and colleagues, and added more fuel to the global anti-queer fire. Gracias, pero no. Thanks, but no thanks. What these 3 recent low points in Catholic Church history have in common is precisely what feminist and queer theologies address. First, they're the result of top-down, male-exclusive power structures. Second, they have devastating consequences in the world. Think Dobbs, and then imagine same-sex marriage in the judicial crosshairs of the Supreme Court. And third, they're based on abysmal ignorance about and less willingness to learn from the experiences of people who are not cis, mostly white men. However, the good news, because feminist and queer theologies first are rooted in the experiences and inclusion of people of various sex, gender constellations, racial, ethnic groups, abilities, age, and so forth. And because queer and feminist theologies are attentive to the real world roots and consequences of their theological work. And because feminist and queer theologies are in constant process of revision and growing complexity of analysis as more and more elements of a diverse world become clear, these 2 feminist and queer branches of theology are vitally necessary to our collective future. Let me offer my analysis. Of course, we need a semester to unpack these issues, but tonight let me simply offer some history and analysis that will help you to see how these 2 theologies function together and imagine how we might move forward to address the crying needs, not just of women and queer people, but of a world at war. Some of us, now many of you perhaps not, but some of us remember when there were basically 2 kinds of theology, Catholic and non-Catholic. We didn't even have the grace to say Protestant. Happily, in the past 75 years, that has changed profoundly. And the theological world is now amazingly diverse, excuse me, colorful, and becoming more colorful with each generation. The reason is simple, if still ignored in many places. The reason is because theology is the fruit of human experiences, understood in the crucible of history and in the light of religious claims. Let me say that one more time. Theology is the fruit of human experiences understood in the crucible of history and in the light of religious claims. Those humans involved have distinct, if overlapping, gender identities, sexual orientations, racial ethnic particularities, and many more rich and varied aspects of their beings, that they bring to reflections on the divine, on right relations or ethics, and on our collective future. Catholic and Protestant differences pale by comparison. Feminist theology is a good example of one such particular approach. Its roots in the US are in the 19th century, when women's suffrage leaders, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Joslyn Gage, recognized that deeply held religious beliefs were barriers to women's full inclusion in society. Instead of focusing only on legal changes, they looked as well at religion, which undergirds so much of cultural formation. Feminist theology was political from the beginning. Stanton gathered a group of women to write their own exegeses of biblical passages, and they compiled them into what was called the Woman's Bible, published in 1895. The book didn't get a lot of traction, but the ideas laid the groundwork for the 1960 article of Valerie Saving, entitled The Human Situation, A Feminine View. Dr. Saving pointed out that the nature of sin and redemption are almost opposite for women and men. Men's sins tend to be sins of power, taking up more than their share of space, whereas women's sins are often self-trivializing and not taking other women very seriously. So religious teachings like the Christian advice to turn the other cheek, counsels to meekness and humility, for example, might be very helpful for men whose sins are sins of power, but lethal for women who already have the self-deprecating approach. Valerie Saving concluded that theology is gendered activity, and so opened gender as a category of theological analysis. 1960. Fast forward a decade to Mary Daly's famous dictum, "If God is male, then the male is God," from her book Beyond God the Father in 1973. If God is male, then the male is God. Daly, with her 3 doctorates from Catholic institutions, Olivia, you're starting one. She had 3 by the time she finished up. Mary Daly unpacked the theological baggage that made God, Father, Lord, Ruler, King the normative expression of the divine, and thus conveyed power to men over women. Going beyond God the Father, as the title of her book stated, began a revolution. Our own dear Rosemary Radford Ruther named the reigning problem as hierarchical dualism, with one aspect of the binary always better than the other. Whether it was the male to the female, the human to the animal, God to the rest of us, that, she said, hierarchical dualism created the problems of inequality. Sean Copeland, an expert on the work of Bernard Lonergan, laid out the public and political dimensions of this feminist work from a Black woman's perspective. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza took on biblical studies, coining the term that many of you know, kyriarchy, Kyriarchy. Kyriarchy kind of rhymes with patriarchy, to show the close relationship, the structures of lordship, as she said, but the close relationship between secular patriarchy and its religious cousin, kyriarchy. Ada Maria Isasi Diaz worked from a Latina perspective. All these Catholic women were working, of course, with hundreds of other feminist scholars and activists, both Catholic and from virtually all religious traditions now, who brought gender analysis and bring gender analysis to bear. They reread church history to include women-identified people. They restructure communities and churches to reflect gender equality. They purge hymns of masculinist and racist images. They rethink ethics with women-identified persons as moral agents. That work goes on, if largely unread and unheeded in Catholic circles, 5 decades later. It's a lot of what we do at Water. The good thing about liberationist work is that once you get it, once that click happens, once you see it, you see it. You get it. And lots of other things follow. I'm reminded of a recent conversation with a woman participant at the Synod meeting in Rome. After a month of talk about togetherness, she was taken aback at the closing liturgy. The clerics, processed in their vestments, sat together and presumably concelebrated while everyone else trailed along with street clothes. So much for synodality. A Catholic Mass at which only ordained men preside is one of the most obviously painful and contradictory venues for conscious feminist persons. Many, like myself, simply make other liturgical arrangements. Similar important insights ground other related forms of theology. For example, Latin American liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez insisted on the theological importance of oppression, prioritizing the experiences of people made poor. His theology of liberation in 1971 and subsequent work in the field of Latin American liberation studies established economics as a key theological indicator and political involvement, a la the suffrage-rooted feminists, as a primary articulation of faith, economics and political involvement. To cite a homey example, who gets paid for ministry is part of the struggle for women's ordination. Likewise, James Cone in his Black Theology and Black Power, 1969. See how far back I'm going? This is a history most of us didn't learn in seminary. James Cone in Black Theology and Black Power, followed by other insights into the Blackness of God and a Black Jesus, established race as a key category to understanding the human condition. Likewise, disability activists have done this work exploring in The Disabled God, Nancy Iceland's project in 1994, and you begin to see in her work toward a liberatory theology of disability, you begin to see a pattern, and it involves taking varied experiences seriously on their own terms. That's the gold standard now in theology. That's what we do. Women in developing countries, as well as women of color and predominantly white countries, made clear their differences with white women and with men of their racial ethnic groups. Womanist or Black feminist theology and teologías feministas emerged. As an anti-racist white feminist, I do not claim to be a womanist. I name my indebtedness to womanists for putting the well-being of women and children at the center of the struggle, where previously white women had only seen the struggle for rights. That's a big shift. So what do? I follow the lead of the late, great Katie Geneva Cannon, of Sean Copeland and others, because their theologies are not simply for Black people, but for all of us. Likewise, Brazilian theologian Ivone Gebara and colleagues in Latin America challenged their brother liberation theologians to take account of women's experiences, just as women theologians have taken on economic and political analysis. My dear Ivone does not report much progress. Alas, I can report that most ecofeminists have embraced the scientific data, but many male ecologists or eco-theologians have yet to include feminist insights in their work. I will leave Laudato Si for another time with its failure to name contraception as an important tool for protecting Earth. But you see where I'm going with this. You begin to see the dynamics, each group building on the other, expecting reciprocity and solidarity from the other, as theologies in the plural, with a small t, replaced theology, capital T. It's not that feminists do theology only for women or Blacks only for Blacks, but all theology is done for all. Theology will never and should never be done the same way again with these insights on our shared table. There's much to learn about this remarkable shift in theological method, which developed largely after Vatican II. But the key takeaway is that theology involves power, power to name the divine, power to decide what's right and wrong, power to shape institutions and laws in diverse cultures. As those who have been marginalized and treated as inferiors claim our rightful place in theological discourse, we expect change in teaching, structures, and ministries to take hold. It's no surprise that those who were used to having the power all to themselves are not pleased. Women, people of color, people from many countries and cultures engage in theological studies arising out of pastoral realities of difference. The old Protestant or Catholic choices fade as gender, race, economics, disability, colonialism, and so much more emerge from the deep resources of many cultures. We cannot be lied to anymore, nor colonized by one cultural set. It's an exciting time to do theology, especially when we rely on the rich theoretical foundations of each struggle. Feminist theory, progressive anti-colonial economic theories, African and African American studies, to name just a few of the sources that virtually never make footnote status in a Vatican document. Now, queer theology emerged as part of this late 20th century activity. It began as lesbian-gay analysis with John McNeill, Kevin Gordon, and John Boswell, among others, doing theology, or in Boswell's case, rereading church history, as if sexual orientation, later gender identity, were categories of analysis, like race and sex before them. Let's see how feminism reshapes queer theory. Bernadette Bruton's tour de force, Love Between Women, Early Christian Responses to Female Homoeroticism from 1996, established that unlike some models of male-male relationships that were top-down, master-slave, teacher-student, older man, younger man, the novelty of women's love for one another was often in egalitarian relationships. Who was on top was not a very interesting question. Women loving women saw the challenge to a patriarchal, lived the challenge to a patriarchal, kyriarchal, top-down, as it were, power paradigm, which characterized many gay relationships in antiquity. Equality is erotic, those ancient women might have whispered to one another. And imagine if they had told their sisters, who then decided that they too wanted this erotic equality in heterosexual relationships. How queer is that? You can hear the Catholic house of cards falling thanks to queer feminist insights, or feminist queer insights if you prefer. Now what we call queer theology covers far more than lesbian and gay lives. It begins with all who transgress the boundaries of heteropatriarchy, bisexual, non-binary, trans people, to name just a few. It emerges from the voices of those who pay a steep price to live into and out of identities that society rejects. Queer theology is indebted to Latin American liberationists for its starting point in the lives of oppressed queer people. Most queer people are oppressed, but we have learned that in kyriarchy, some are exponentially more oppressed than others, such as trans and people of color versus white cis folks like me. Queer theology lines up with Black theology, illuminating the difference race makes for queer people. Racism only makes heterosexism more dangerous, and queer people of color more vulnerable. Queer theology connects to feminist theology with the creation of new images of the divine that change and expand. Our gods and goddesses are equally and wonderfully queer. Again, the pattern holds. Queer theology does not replace another theology, but builds on the strong foundation that brings queer experience into mainstream conversation. Now, thanks to queer insights, virtually all sex-gender categories are in flux. So the theological enterprise in all that it touches, ministry, spirituality, liturgy, social justice, it's all back to square one. There are no experts yet. Our task is to listen and try to understand yet another iteration of human experience in all of its grandeur and goodness. Let me conclude by saying there's plenty more to look at here, many more theologies with intermingled roots to learn from and with one another. I'll conclude with a few suggestions for our common work ahead, and then we can open it for discussion. First, my first suggestion, and it's a serious one, is that reciprocity and solidarity must ground our common work. Reciprocity means embracing the struggle of others, even if it is not central to our agenda. Reciprocity means embracing the struggles of others, even if it is not central to our agenda. Solidarity means acting, despite danger, in concert with those who struggle, accepting the liability that goes with it. For example, active anti-racism is a common task, yes or yes. Concern for women identified persons, especially those facing hard choices about reproduction, that concern remains a moral priority in these rocky times. Queer people of all stripes need specific and sustained support, especially in institutional Catholicism. The point is not to be an ally, but an advocate. Some of you will remember that Jesus didn't leave an ally, but an advocate in the Holy Spirit. So forget the ally, be the advocate. These are tasks for everyone, not only for those seeking their rights and their liberation. Let me give you a few examples just to be very concrete about what I mean. White people need not just include or work with people of color, but learn from and be led by people of color. Male priests need to actively dismantle their clerical privilege by demanding and supporting women, in all forms of ministry, and demanding all forms of ministry for women. meanwhile refusing to take women's places. This means to stop presiding in the absence of women leaders. That may go down hard for some, but I mean it sincerely. At the very least, a priest can commit not to concelebrate, unless the whole community concelebrates. Anything less only adds insult to injury. Yes, job loss will result, but so will change if we're serious about being a Eucharistic community with integrity. Lesbian, bi, gay people cannot proclaim or protect our rights if trans and non-binary people's rights are not fully included. Full stop. You begin to get the idea here that I do have some pretty concrete ways of making reciprocity and solidarity work. And the final one I want to mention is men need to make vasectomies at least as common as abortions. And conversation about vasectomies a normative part of sexual ethics. These are examples of reciprocity and solidarity. You can imagine others, we can talk about them. But I want to be very clear that this is not cheap work. This is expensive work, and it takes its cost. But it is, I believe, the work of people who proclaim the gospel. My second suggestion is plan on backlash being used to divide and conquer us, to solidify the status quo, and be ready to push back against backlash. As married Lutheran and Episcopalian men join the Roman Catholic ranks because they oppose the ordination of women and queer people, we see the sinister genius of Rome to homogenize all things to its benefit. I predict a similar move on women deacons, with women being offered a kind of pseudo-diaconal role as deaconesses with a lot of work and no access to orders. That is, no jurisdiction, no decision-making. Those who accept such a half measure will miss the theopolitical boat, and it is a big ship. It's coming toward us. This requires planning to avert and serious strategizing across our various social and ecclesial locations. We have to be ready to say no when the Vatican tries to pull this one off. There will be other instances where change for some will come at the expense of others. For example, if heterosexual priests are allowed to marry, what about queer priests? Would any heterosexual priests accept such changes? Or would gay priests accept such changes without women being ordained? I fear so, but I insist that solidarity requires strong stances, and I invite those involved to talk seriously before the decisions are presented. My third suggestion, as if backlash weren't enough, my third suggestion is what Black feminist writer Audre Lorde famously observed, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. By that, she meant that we need to learn, think, and act outside the box. I recommend that in theology, where many other faith traditions are so far beyond patriarchal and parochial Catholic thinking, that we start to listen and learn across our denominational lines. For example, the first English language article on lesbians and theology was written by one of my favorites, Sally Miller Gearhart, in 1973. I bet there aren't 10 people on this call who've ever heard of Sally Miller Gearhart. Although there's a documentary film coming out about her very soon called Sally, so you'll get a full sense of Sally Miller Gearhart. She came from a Protestant background, taught at a religious college, and her essay, The Lesbian and God the Father, is a must-read. There's simply no Catholic equivalent, and she wrote it in 1973. She said, and I quote, I can't separate the lesbian from the woman. And being a lesbian, she said, involves some growing political consciousness. Now, that's 1973. I remember reading a mimeographed copy of this phenomenal article, and I actually have a copy of it right here because I keep it close and I read it often. This was the little article that started lesbian feminist questions in religion, 1973. Brilliant analysis on a mimeographed page. I knew it was revelation. Likewise, evangelical feminist Virginia Ramey Mollenkott. How many of us read evangelicals? In her work, Is the Homosexual My Neighbor, in 1994 with Letha Scanzoni. And Mollenkott's own Sensuous Spirituality, out from Fundamentalism, in 92. And later her Omnigender, a trans-religious approach, are all essential reads by someone who graduated from Bob Jones University. They put our timid Catholic efforts to shame. These do not appear on our bibliographies because we were colonized intellectually and spiritually to think that the master's tools, the Catholic ones, would dismantle the master's Catholic house. Now it's clear that we need a wide range of sources, including those from evangelicals like these people, from queer Jews and Muslims, from those without religious connections. It's so easy to get parochial about sources. We need to learn from other movements. 50 years ago, this time, Episcopal women were ordained. The documentary Philadelphia 11, as the Episcopal first women priests were called, shows how they got equality by the vote of the church's two houses. The recent United Methodist vote to change their book of discipline to accept all people, including queer people, as members and ministers, has much to teach us. The main takeaway from these two examples is that structural change is imperative for the changes we seek on women's and queer issues. That is seemingly an impossible lift in Catholicism, but simply to be given our rights by benevolent patriarchs is unlikely, and on a good day, antithetical to the rights themselves. Today, there are more than 4,000 Episcopal women priests, including 40% of all their priests ordained in the last 5 years. Beth Stroud, a Methodist minister who was defrocked decades ago because she's a lesbian, has now had her ordination restored. Her bishop knelt before her in a gesture of penitence. She prayed over him. Can we even imagine such things? No, not until we think outside the box. And so, as I said at the outset, feminist and queer theologies are of a piece, and they inform the whole of theology, not just little groups. There are not just two communities, queer and feminist, but many intersecting groups that are focused on equity, justice, and care of earth. In order to do our part in the long road toward equity and justice, we'll need to act with reciprocity and solidarity beyond what we can even imagine tonight. We need to plan how to deal with the backlash that will inevitably divide and conquer us if we don't strategize together. And we will need to think wildly and extravagantly outside the box, being informed by sources and people we least expect to shape our lives. I predict that along the way, we will also realize just how closely we are allied as Catholics and our friends, who can proudly and with delight call ourselves queer feminists, feminist queers, knowing that our shared commitments matter. Such working together mirrors creation's own intricate and intimate, and finally quite mysterious ways of operating for the common good. Thank you so much.
Mary, thank you so much for that really rich presentation. I learned so much in the past 30 minutes. I feel like my brain is on fire in a really good way. Especially appreciated you getting other voices from liberation theology to kind of get us to where these histories are. So thank you so much. I want to invite folks to use the hand raising function to offer a question, or feel free to use the chat. I see our chat box is already populating. But I did want to, offer the first comment, which is, you said in your presentation, once you see the liberation theology, you see it and you know it and you get it. And I just wanted to say that really resonated for me. For those that don't know this about me, I went to an Opus Dei Catholic high school, which is totally the opposite end of my personal theology as a woman working in this field. And I went to a college where my very first class was liberation theology on the very first day. And it was exactly that kind of clicked. So just thank you so much for this. And I see so many questions coming up. Is it Marie Fortune has her hand raised? So I'll invite you to offer a question. But thank you again, Mary. This was amazing.
My pleasure. Thank you. Dr. Fortune, please go ahead.
Dr. Hunt, lovely to see you, and thank you so much for your most insightful presentation. I just had a curiosity about the sociology of the number of gay men who are Catholic priests and how that intersects with why there is not more progress in said institution around either queer or feminist theology and practice. If you would comment.
Yeah, thank you. And I just have to say before I do that many of you will recognize Marie Fortune as the founding director of the Faith Trust Institute in Seattle, which is which was the go-to place on issues of sexual and domestic violence. And I'm honored that you're with us tonight, Dr. Fortune, also ordained in the United Church of Christ and longtime minister. So yeah, here's the problem. First of all, we don't have any numbers, but we all have anecdotal evidence that would indicate that the vast majority, excuse me, at least in my experience, and I went to Jesuit seminary and so forth, but the vast majority of Catholic priests are gay. This presents an interesting problem of both self-hatred and self-protection. It also makes for a very difficult, some very difficult coalition building, especially around questions of women, because for a long time, and I think, not to be too simplistic about it, but for a long time, I think there was a sense that for some men who were or discovered or decided to be queer, the priesthood was really a great option because nobody asked you if you wanted to get married, why you weren't married or why you didn't have children or, whatever. And you could do the ministry that you felt called to do, which many of us have been prevented from doing for a long time. And also you could do it in a fairly protected environment where there were a lot of codes about silence and protection and civility and so forth. In my view, what happens then is you set up the Catholic Church, the institutional patriarchal church, set up a very sick system of don't ask, don't tell. Everybody knows. People don't like to talk about it. But this is real. So I think those are sort of shaping factors. And then what happens is that when you have people who are oppressed, who are keeping secrets and living in such structured duplicity, I would call it, kind of structures of lies, it becomes very unhealthy and untenable. And then when people come along who are healthy and say, wait, excuse me, we're living in these wonderful relationships, and as society has moved along on this question and seen the many and varied queer people who live open lives, whether coupled or not is not the issue. Maybe in triads, I'm not mine to judge, as it were. But lots of different permutations of the human condition. And then you still have the party line coming out from the institutional church. Like, the good news is a lot of people don't listen to it. The bad news is kids commit suicide because of it. And I think these are, those are the bookends of the problem within the institutional church. There also is a certain baked in misogyny that I think is a piece of this as well. And we have to be honest about that the extent to which the anthropology on which all this is based is inferior, superior, kind of what Rosemary called hierarchical dualism, is the heart of it. And so for a man who, if he were gay in the culture without being a priest, would have quite a number of challenges to go into a system where he is privileged, not only among other men, but certainly among above other men, but certainly above all women. That's a pretty enticing deal, except for the pathology that it represents. And I mean that pathology, both theological and psychological. And I think we might be at a moment when we can be more honest about this and begin to say, no, we're not going to do that anymore. Let's not play that anymore. But it's going to take, and that's why I'm hoping that many priests who are gay will flock to out of their closets with the warm welcome of people like me, because I think it will improve the quality of ministry across the board. But it requires their taking seriously the needs of women and dependent children, doing their anti-racism work. I mean, it requires that reciprocity and solidarity. And I think that's what's really exciting and challenging about what's ahead. So not the best answer to your question, maybe, Marie, but at least beginning to get at some of the parameters of it.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear. Glad you're here, Marie. Glad to have healthy Protestant and others to be leaven for us. We need you.
Great. Well, I see a question in the chat, which is, what would happen if individual bishops simply ordained women deacons? Would the Vatican kick these bishops out of their positions? What if Catholic bishops in certain progressive countries simply do instead of waiting for the world church to catch up? What do you think would happen? I'm interested to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I really haven't thought about it, to tell the truth, because I'm not really in favor of ordaining anybody. I think that one of the real problems we have is that we are being, and again, even the very conversation about deacons and priests and women and so forth, sucks us back into that kind of patriarchal structure of church, which, as I tried to say at the end of my remarks, in terms of, not being able to vote, I think the structural changes have to come first. So I think whether some bishops do that or not could cut either way. I think it could end up, and it would probably be instrumentalized to move toward regularization, because it would be valid but illicit, just like what happened with the Anglican, the Episcopal women. It was, their ordinations were valid but illicit. That's why everyone was so hyped about it, because they were valid. That's why the RCWP, etc., women have been excommunicated on the exit from, if they get ordained, they're excommunicated, because these are valid ordinations, again, in a very weird kind of mindset. But it would be easier to regularize those and not have to make very many changes in the institutional church, and keep the structure of kyriarchy, which looks like this, intact. I don't happen to favor that. I think that the better models of church are infrastructured, intersecting circles and places where on the edges you have some real connections. But I don't know what would happen to those bishops, but my guess is there won't be too many of them wanting to find out anytime soon. And if there are some, I think it's going to take all kinds of things to change this institution. I never rule out or say there's only one strategy. I learned how wrong I was when I thought that at a moment. I think there are lots. It takes a lot. It's not a one, this will do it. It's going to take a lot. So, if they want to do it, well, fine, great. Certainly they've been given invitations. I can attest to the fact that they've been given invitations to do that. And up until this point, I'm trying to think. Can't put a name with a face there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another question from the chat that came up while you were just talking, which I think is relevant, and you might have sort of answered it in your response, but I'll offer it anyway, is Betty Blutz has said, how useful is organized religion? Which I think is a pretty big question in this space, but would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, if you, just talking about the American context, I mean, obviously increasingly less. And, every time the Pew Foundation comes out with a study, when Pew comes out with a study, or some of the other larger tracking operations come out with studies, organized religion is losing market share, dropping like a stone, starting with the Catholics. We lose more than anybody. We're down to what we used to be 24% of the population. We're now 20 and dropping. The percentage of people who actually go to church, as it were, who attend weekly mass, is pretty small. And the numbers are really, when you factor the age in, it's mostly people who look like me that can even, spell mass at this point. I mean, younger people just aren't really, for the most part, and those who are interested tend to be enormously conservative. So we have this kind of irony that all this work that's been done by progressive Catholics since Vatican II to make changes will make changes for people who are enormously conservative, will be the only ones left to live them out. So that I find rather intriguing as well. But the organized religion as a thing in this country has probably seen its best days.
Yeah, I totally agree. As a young person kind of exploring this field, I find my peers to be few and far between, or peers that I can engage with in a similar mindset, even further between. So yeah, thank you. I will just shout out what Russ just put in the chat about Martha's work on different models of community that are popping up. So folks should check that out if you haven't seen it in the chat. But we have a little bit more time, so I invite folks who have questions or even just comments to raise their hand. Oh, Peggy Thompson.
Hey, Peggy.
Hi, Mary. Good to see you. Great
Good to
as
see you
always.
too.
I just, we've talked about what Pope Francis recently did in terms of his adamant no about ordination, but I found it equally disturbing, if less institutional, the statement that was publicized the other day about him apparently telling priests not to gossip because that's what women do.
Yeah.
And the reason I mention that, and I'd like you to kind of reflect on it, is because the problem of kyriarchy and the problem of gender bigotry goes so far beyond institutional roles and things like ordination and so forth to these kind of fundamental attitudes. So I'd like you to just talk about that a little bit, if you would. Thanks.
Sure. And it's great to see you. And for people who don't know, Peggy Thompson is not only professor at Syracuse University, but also one of the world's experts on American nuns, and a serious scholar of this, with a book coming out in the not too distant future. So we look forward to that, Peggy. And I'm sure FutureChurch will nab
Thanks.
you.
They've already had me, so they may not want me back, but
They might when the book is
You
out.
never know.
They might. I'll lobby for it. But yeah, and
You're
it
always welcome
also
back,
belongs.
Peggy. Sorry.
Yeah, Peggy
Sorry,
also
you're
belongs.
always welcome back, Peggy.
thank
Yeah.
you, Russ.
Peggy also comes from St. Lucy's Church in Syracuse, New York, which is one of the few churches I've ever been to, and that are worthy of the name. And that's a great place. I might see you in August, Peggy. But what I think the issue is that you're absolutely right, and that's why the ordination of women and of anyone is a problem for me, because it is another way in which hierarchy works. And Sally Miller Gerhardt, in this famous essay of hers, talks about that. It says, no, 1973, no really conscious women want to do that. And so I think that is something that we need to think about, and to say, do we give scandal by entering into a hierarchical institution as women, and taking on those roles? Because you're absolutely right that that's the problem. And that's why there's such a difference in a feminist view of these questions and a well-meaning patriarchal view. Because the well-meaning patriarchal view is, of course, everyone would want to be if you could be a priest or a bishop, everyone would want to be that. But from a feminist perspective, say, who would want to be that? Who would want to have that? Who wants to have that anyway in the cosmos? And so I think that's what I'm trying to point out here, is that there's a real difference. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that queer theology wants that. I'm suggesting that patriarchal, kyriarchal theology wants that, and that's the contrast with feminism. But that's why we have different strategies, because some of us are saying, excuse me, why would you want to do that? Both for what it means in terms of being church, and what it means when we show to people in other fields of human endeavor that we could tolerate that for 15 minutes. I mean, that's really the issue. Otherwise, I mean, of course, the competent women among us should be in those positions, and that would be that. But no, it's because the structure is wrong, not because the gender is wrong, although the gender is wrong up to a certain point. The other thing is, I think in terms of Pope Francis, and I lived in Argentina for a couple of years, so I know something about Argentine men's humor. And this, the gossip in women and so forth, this is kind of a trope out of his old neighborhood. He lived in Flores. I lived in Flores. I know this neighborhood. It's a kind of a trope, that the gossipy old women, and he doesn't have any sense that that's very insulting, even to his abuelita Rosita, his grandmother Rosie. That is sort of his reference point for women in the world, God rest her soul. But I think his comments about women as the strawberries on the cake, and women theologians are the strawberries on the cake. I mean, this is just a kind of humor that doesn't translate well. Let's put it that way. Doesn't play in Argentina either, but it doesn't translate well. Who else? Thanks, Peggy. Great to see you, dear. Who else is around? Let's see.
We've got some questions in the chat if you want
let's take
to
those.
take
Sure.
a look. Yeah.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
have one too when you have a chance. This is Chris Schenk.
Oh,
Just when
Chris
you have a
Schenk.
chance.
Absolutely. Chris Schenk, why don't you go next?
Okay. Well, Mary, it's always wonderful to hear you and to be with you, and I've admired you for a very long time. I just
I could
have
only say the same, Chris, and you know
I
it.
know,
Only
and we
say the
don't
same.
we haven't been on the same page about everything, most things, but
and greatly working with reciprocity and solidarity. I mean, that's what
Exactly.
you and I are a good
Exactly.
example of it, and I'm
I
very happy for that.
Yeah. Well, I just want to throw in another thread here because I think, I mean, certainly I think Francis would love to have deaconettes instead of,
Yeah.
and all of that. But the place where I still have hope, maybe I'm crazy, is all the things about votes for women at the synod and some of the structural stuff that the working groups this summer were talking about in terms of having evaluation for bishops, evaluation for priests. I think the other thread with Francis, I think he does have a great respect for ordinary Catholics, and I think it comes from his work in Argentina with many of the base communities. So for me, the preferred future, and I'm with you with many doubts about ordaining women and adding women and stirring. I have my wonderings about that, given the present structure. I don't know why anyone would want to be ordained in the present structure, frankly. But the other thread is to have governance and jurisdiction in the church rest with baptism rather than ordination. And so at least some of the threads that I've seen as far as the synod piece unfolding, like the first time women ever had vote at the synod, it makes me wonder, is that a potential hopeful thread, or is it, I don't know. I just want to throw that in there because I'm sort of a perpetual optimist sometimes, but there is some basis for it. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, and Chris, I offer them with the deepest gratitude for your long years at this work and with great respect for how you see things. I think hope is always warranted. I mean, I don't think there's ever a time when people who come from where we come from are without hope. Or as Holly Near sings, oh, to be hopeless would seem so strange. Well, that's quite right. But I do think that there are some real problems, and I think the synod is fundamentally a structural non-starter because
Mhm.
What we've just experienced in these three instances that I talked about that Russ mentioned two of are in fact instances where the synod is in some ways a busy work, keep people occupied, stretch
Yeah.
their attention in the direction, recenter Rome as the center of the church, because when it comes down to it, all the talking notwithstanding, and now kicking the can down the road and moving the goalposts in terms of the second session, and there's not going to be any this, and there's not going to be any decisions, and there's only going to be committee reports, and not even all those.
Mhm.
Wake up, and I say to people, wake up and smell the incense here. You're being had, I think, by
Okay.
something that is impossible, that is the squaring of a circle. And I think when you have a structure where the talk is about we're all in this together and we all gonna walk along, blah, blah, and push our wheelchairs and, work with children and, those little pretty drawings and so forth. But then when it comes down to it, structurally, there's no suggestion that anybody but the Pope and obviously those with whom he collaborates are going to make decisions. That is a non-starter. That's not going to work. So
I hear you.
that I don't have hope about, and that makes me sad. I also think there's a lot of hype about Francis in terms of his own view. And I came away from that Nora O'Donnell interview realizing two things. One is that he's fundamentally a pastor and not a theologian in the sense of not even being an activist theologian. I mean, he's not
Mhm.
very sophisticated theologically, and he does tend
That's right.
to pivot toward the kind of these nice little comments and so forth, and you know he pivoted to Nora O'Donnell saying, well, you have a lot of emotion around that, you're really you're really invested in that whatever the question was, you're really invested in that, and he thought that was a good thing. This is someone who's not really grappling, I think, with some of the things that we eat for breakfast, the people like us eat for breakfast, and so that's disappointing. It's also the case that when he was in Argentina, and I was in Argentina for 2 years during the dictatorship, and I never he was in Jesuit leadership in those years, 80 and 81, And I'm not sure that he was so engaged with base communities. I think the tendency in Argentina in those days was not even liberation theology. It was what devolved into something called theology of the people, which was a much softer, more acceptable form. It did not have the kind of economic analysis, certainly didn't have any feminist analysis. It had almost no colonialist, post-colonial analysis. And so I'm not so sure. I mean, he
I
wasn't
think it
playing.
was after the dictatorship. I think he sort of got converted by some of his priests.
Yeah, I hope so. But all I'm saying is I think that there's some hope for him. He's certainly done more than his predecessors, of most recent 2 or 3 predecessors combined. But um, you
No,
know,
I hear you.
he's got a long ways to go. And I don't mean that to be negative about him, just to be honest about the history.
Yeah,
And I think governance is a critical issue here, because it's the question of power. And feminists and queer people do not need to apologize for wanting
that's
power.
right.
What we
That's right.
want is the power that is shared in the community.
Yeah.
Let's go, Chris, let's move on. You and I can talk forever, I'm sure, but let's go on. Lori Wright, Gary is next. Happy to see you too.
Hi, Mary. I've really enjoyed your talk. My concern is I'm a religious studies chair at Mount St. Mary's University in Los Angeles. And so my concern is the dwindling number of religious studies departments, and the fact that often when somebody leaves who's full-time tenured, they're not replaced with somebody who's tenured. And I do want to say one kind of exciting thing our department is doing, and Sister Darlene is also on the call or on this, and she's my colleague in the department. We do have a minor in what's called social justice and sexual diversity. And so it looks at LGBTQ issues from the standpoint of world religions, and it's all from like an inclusive language. So trying to give the history and find the history within different religions of where there's been inclusion, and to show that, this isn't just the 1% we're talking about, but some religious institutions have been much more open and much more accepting than we have, and to see those as, I guess, billboards for us to follow and models for us. So I just wanted to share those 2 things. And anything you have for religious studies departments. One concern I have is we have more administrators now who are not Catholic, and so they don't see the importance of theology or religious studies. And I don't know what we can do about that, but I'm open to suggestions. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. And thanks for the great work you're doing. It sounds like a very exciting program. And also a reason why people want to study theology.
Right.
Now, let's look at the Catholic case. However, let's say you're a young woman and you have student loans, and you have the thought of having something called a job, or a job, after you finish. Having a degree in theology is probably no more practical today than it was when I did it. But I think this is a problem. And I think this is where Catholic institutions really do need to step up as well. And, it would be criminal if we were educating people in other fields and there were no jobs for them. I mean, those are
Right.
the departments that get cut first, because parents don't want to pay tuition for careers their children aren't going to have. I mean, it's as simple as that. So that's a problem. But I also think the question that you raised at the end about administrators is that that's sort of these are the larger problems of higher education. But one of them is that many, if not most, of the currently named administrators of universities, including Jesuit schools that have run out of Jesuits and now hire women and other lay persons, they tend to hire MBAs, people with law degrees. People are going to do real estate, because really the big problem is often real estate at this point. And these kinds of people, God bless them, and I'm sure they're good at what they do, are not what you and I are used to in terms of the kind of thinking that goes on. They think, but not the kind of thinking that goes into shaping a curriculum that does have a values base and does come from a tradition and is based on some tremendous work that I think in the liberal arts, especially at the undergraduate level, can be very, very useful for learning how to think, learning how to do, understanding privilege, all those kinds of things. So that's kind of endemic in higher education, but we're not going to solve that one. I do think the Catholic case that you're describing is made even worse, and Peggy Thompson can back me up on this, by the fact that there are now, we've discovered, some educational institutions that do have women's studies programs, Catholic institutions that have women's studies programs, queer studies, they are now call them queer, but they're sex gender programs. But interestingly enough, the content is the flip side of anything I've been talking about tonight. And that's really shocking. Peggy, do you want to say something about that? Because that's really pretty shocking for people.
Well, it's a big, complicated issue, and maybe it's something Future Church could have a little panel on at some point. But and I think Lori would be somebody who would be a great participant in that, because it sounds like your institution is doing some creative things. But I think that there's so much complexity in that. We see it even in the debates. You were very forceful, and I think rightly so, and I'm grateful for it, about the fact that LGBTQ includes the T and the Q as much as it does the others. And yet there's so much debate about that now, about whether trans women are real women, whether, all of gender fluidity, what does that mean? And these are complicating things. And I think administrators often use this as a way to undermine the whole program, because if they can divide us, and if they can, prevent us from seeing that we all have to deal with hierarchical structures, then they win.
Yeah.
And pretty much everybody else loses.
Yeah, and I was particularly referring to the women's studies programs that actually teach Catholic women's studies programs. That is,
yes, there's a new program.
Yeah, the theology of the body. Yeah,
they're doing theology of the body, and they're really, the founder of the new feminism, according to them, is John Paul II. And so
the matron saint, as it were.
These are programs and they're often led by men, often led by clerical men, that are meant to challenge and counter the work that all of us, or so many of us in this group, are doing from a variety of perspectives.
And they're called women's studies programs, and they're called sex and gender programs.
And they're called Catholic feminism.
Yeah, so watch for those, because this is one of the more pernicious ways of taking the mainstream ideas and subverting them. It's fairly quite clever when you think about it.
It's very clever, but we can't let them get away with it. Yes, thank you for reminding me that, because we were discussing it the other day. And they're also trying to catch other people and to reassure them that, they have the real response here.
Right. Marie Fortune, we'll go back to you. And then Russ looks like he wants to get in. Good luck, Russ. I'm teasing. Go ahead, Marie.
Let me bring Marie back on here.
Yeah.
Okay, just quickly, Mary, and you know that I bring this question with the utmost respect for you and all Catholic women.
Why do you do it?
But I have to know, and I continue to be puzzled, given the power of the institution, is why do you?
Yeah. Well, the framing of the question is always so interesting, because the why do you stay is easy to describe. We just haven't gone anywhere. It's the institution that has so strayed, most of us would say, from any semblance of gospel values, or any certainly any of the spirituality of the medieval women mystics or so forth, that has gone by the wayside. And what we've done, most of us, is to in union with people like you and others, to engage in the works of love and justice, because we understand how, from socioeconomic and anti-racist and pro-queer perspectives, the world works. And one of the things that we know is that images about the divine, images of what's good and what's holy, shape who's good and who's holy, and they shape what is seen as acceptable behavior, what is allowable, For example, tonight I'm fit to be tied watching what good Catholic Joe Biden did around at the border today. I mean, I think that's a real question to raise as a Catholic. So I like being in these conversations. It's also because you know, we laugh at Catholic jokes and we speak Catholic, and we have no reason. I have no reason to apologize. You know, I have no reason to say that this is. What I do say is this is what Catholic looks like in the 21st century. That we look queer, we look feminist, we look Black, we look brown, we look old, we look young, we look able-bodied, we look like we live with disability. You know, that's one of the things that's so exciting about being Catholic, that you don't tire of it because it doesn't define you. You become part of its ongoing definition. And so for me to say that I am not Catholic, although, you know, sometimes I also say, well, you know, why am I Catholic? For spite? You know, it's really just spite, but it's not that at all. It's that I really deeply respect and believe in the values of love and justice in a world where they are honored in the breach on a good day. I mean, this is a terrible day to say that a Catholic president came up with, you know, signed off on this policy that will have such devastating implications for thousands of people each week. And you know, I wrestle with that, but I want to wrestle with that because to live without that, without somehow that being a problem, it seems to me be a rather inhumane way to live. So again, not a good answer for you, Marie, but it's what I've got. And, I think
Thank you.
Yeah.
My deepest.
Mary, I put the link to that program on Catholic women's studies or whatever from the University of St. Thomas in the chat, if anyone's interested in checking it out.
Yeah, great. And Russ, will you, or may I, somebody, I want to download the chat so that I can respond to people as well. Maybe you can do that, and I'll respond.
Sure, yeah,
Those
I
of you who
will.
didn't get a chance to talk with, I'll certainly respond to you from the chat. So,
Mary, this was just an incredible evening. Your presentation was fantastic. I felt like it was a book in the making. Not to give you more work to do, but I felt like it was a book in the making, or at least an extended article, and it obviously generated so much wonderful conversation. So thank you very much, Mary, for being with us. We are honored to have hosted you.
thank you. And I want to thank you and Olivia and your staff and all those who participated, really. And feel free to contact me at mhunt@hers.com if you want further conversation, or go to the Water website at www.waterwomensalliance.org. And I just wish everybody the best and a great evening. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to more.
Great. Thanks, Mary.